Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. In this session, we'll be looking at why associating with good people is so important on the Noble Eightfold Path. It's part of our examination of the Avijjā Sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, so Numerical Discourses, Chapter 10, Discourse number 61. Initially, we looked at Part 1, which was the insight pathway for the arising, the samudaya of ignorance, and therefore the growing increase of ignorance. And rather than launch into the insight pathway for the way out of ignorance, or the passing away of ignorance, the atthangama, because there are a lot of deep dhammas in this second part, it's a good idea to actually look at some of the component parts on their own, and to actually compare and contrast against the ignorant path to get a better understanding, a deeper grounding in order for us to understand the whole insight pathway. So in this session, we'll be looking at the distinction in particular between associating with bad company, bad people, as defined by the Buddha, and looking at why Buddha emphasizes the importance of associating with good people as defined by the Buddha. One of the very important things to start with is really around definition. And so we're going to be looking at the definitions. But it's important to see that the Buddha doesn't mean good people equals nice people. And some of the yardsticks that we use to measure good people in conventional life, there's actually a lot more that the Buddha associates in terms of the definition of a good person, sappurisa in Pali. And likewise, as we saw from part 1, bad people, as defined by the Buddha, doesn't just mean criminals. It actually means something more than that. And that can be quite surprising. So let's begin. The first thing to look at is the qualities of a bad person, or what defines a bad person, an asappurisa as the Buddha terms it. And the main thing, without going through the whole list, because we covered this in part 1, is that this kind of person doesn't actually walk the Buddha's path and doesn't embody or practice the qualities that the Buddha recommends, and is constantly or regularly cultivating the unwholesome, so the akusala, and they lack integrity, and they don't behave properly towards the good people, whether it's their mother, father, or the Buddha and the Noble Arahants, or those training in the Buddha's pathway. And they very much practice the wrong things, so they praise things that are not worthy to be praised, and they criticize things that are deserving of praise. And a lot of what they practice is quite dubious, and they show a lot of ingratitude and thanklessness. And one of the key things is that they're constantly glorifying themselves and putting others down. And one of the things when you look at the qualities of a bad person, they're easier to recognize in others than in ourselves. But the truth is that when we're training on the Buddha's path, we do actually inhabit some of these bad qualities. And when we walk the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path, what we're trying to do is actually draw back from these qualities and try our best to actually manifest the Buddha's teachings. But in sum, what actually defines a bad person is that they're not following the Buddha's path, the Noble Eightfold Path. They're not cultivating the type of virtue that is needed for the Buddha's path. And they are actually quite defiled. Like they breed defilements and allow the hindrances to take hold. And so that's what you get when you associate with a bad person. When we look at the suttas and we look at what the Buddha and the Noble Arahants say about sappurisas, so good people, then what we find is that it is the complete opposite of what the Buddha defines as a bad person. So this is a person that keeps precepts, manifest the good qualities defined by the Buddha. And particularly these qualities are the qualities that are of benefit towards walking the Noble Eightfold Path. And then this is a person that also cultivates the right kind of speech, so refrains from lying, refrains from harsh speech, refrains from divisive speech, and refrains from empty speech. Because this person knows that it's steeped in lobha, dosa, moha. Greed, hatred, and delusion is where this kind of wrong speech comes from. And of course, this person cultivates wholesome deeds and walks the Noble Eightfold Path, if not the Noble Tenfold Path. And by contrast, this person has integrity. And this manifests particularly in the way that they speak, that they don't speak ill of others, even when asked, let alone when not asked. They speak well of another, even when asked, even when not asked, let alone when asked. And when it comes to themselves, they are more willing to come forward with their bad points, even when they're not asked. And when it comes to praising themselves, like speaking well of themselves, even when asked, let alone not asked, they don't really pipe up and speak about it. And of course, they behave rightly as opposed to wrongly towards their mother, father, the Buddha, and the disciples of the Buddha. And likewise, when it comes to looking at others, without examining or scrutinizing, they criticize those that are deserving of criticism, and they praise those that are worthy of praise, deserving of praise. And again, they arouse faith in things that are worthy of inspiration, and they don't arouse faith towards things which are dubious. And they're grateful and thankful. And so they know how to be grateful and thankful. And importantly, they don't glorify themselves and put others down based on worldly things, based on the family, the background, popularity, fame, material possessions, those kinds of worldly yardsticks. Instead, they are more measured. And they certainly don't glorify themselves for what they have learned, particularly in Dhamma. And they don't glorify themselves when it comes to attainments on the spiritual path. So in sum, a good person, a sappurisa, is someone that is walking the Noble Eightfold Path, is walking the Buddha's path in terms of his teachings, keeps precepts, is training towards those things, tries to develop the qualities that the Buddha says support the path, and clearly doesn't want to cultivate defilements and hindrances and all the unwholesome things. Now, the ultimate sappurisa, the ultimate good person, is the Buddha, followed by the noble arahants, and then followed by those that are training towards full awakening, towards Nibbana. These are considered good people. And of course, if one really wants to get into the mindset, get into the shoes of someone who is a sappurisa, then you put yourself into the shoes of the Buddha, put yourself into the shoes of the noble arahants, and you think, what would they do? How would they behave? How would they speak? And how would they be thinking? And of course, when you put yourself into their shoes, then you understand clearly that it would be the dasa kusala, the 10 wholesome conduct, that through body, speech and mind, they would cultivate the wholesome. And then, of course, they would not cause any of the defilements to arise, and they would not cause any of the hindrances to arise. And if they did arise, they would quickly abandon them. And instead, they would cultivate the kusala. They would actually cultivate those things that are very wholesome. So that means the 10 wholesome conduct instead, through body, speech and mind. And they would guard anything that has been developed and cultivated that is good, that which it includes path and fruit on the spiritual path. So this is what Buddha defines as a good person. One of the suttas that is very helpful when it comes to understanding the importance of associating with good people is the Chula Purnima Sutta. And this is in the Majjhima Nikaya, and it's discourse number 110. And the reason why this sutta is so very important is because it actually answers particular questions around not just the qualities of a good person, which reflects some of what we've been through, but what happens when you associate with good people and the intentions of a good person, the counsel of a good person, and of course the speech, actions, views, and the giving of a good person. But the most important ones are the association with good people and the intentions and counsel of good people. So just to quickly run through, the good qualities that this particular teaching provides about a good person, about a sappurisa, is that a good person cultivates the 7 good qualities. So it's the qualities of conviction, moral shame, fear of wrongdoing, being learned, being energetic, mindful, and of course wise. And if you recognize these qualities, they're the same qualities that are promoted by the Buddha throughout the Sutta Pitaka, as well as within the Sekapatipada Sutta. So this is where Venerable Ananda explained these 7 qualities again. And these qualities support the trainee's path towards Nibbana. Now, when you associate with a good person, that means you're friends, you're a companion with such a person, and they become like a kalyanamitta, a good friend. So this is why we want to associate with a good person, or how we associate with a good person. And this sutta then goes on to talk about the intentions of a good person. So it's when a good person doesn't intend to hurt themselves, hurt others, or hurt both. That's how a good person has the intention of a good person. And then it goes on to say, a good person offers counsel that doesn't hurt themselves, hurt others, or hurt both. So when you associate with a good person, then these kinds of things rub off. That you start to develop the same kind of intentions, that you don't intend to hurt yourself, you don't intend to hurt others, and of course you bear in mind that you don't want to hurt both parties, yourself or others. And so where you come from is very much fulfilling part of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is right intention. So it's one of renunciation, one of non-ill will, and one of non-covetousness. That's how you don't hurt other people. That's how you don't hurt yourself, and both. And then when it comes to counsel, again, your actions, they come from this kind of intention, that you don't actually, before you speak, you actually think about, will this hurt me? Will this hurt others? Will it hurt both? And so you make your choices based on that. And so when you associate with a good person, you learn how this works. You actually are around people that support this kind of intention, this kind of counsel. And so it's a much more gentle kind of company, rather than one that is quite harsh and one that is quite harmful or hurtful. And of course we recognize the type of speech and action of a good person. So when it comes to speech, you refrain from the 4 kinds of bad speech. So you refrain from lying, from divisive speech, from harsh speech, and empty speech. And then when it comes to action, you refrain from killing living beings, from taking what hasn't been given, and from sexual misconduct. But one of the most important things is the view of a good person. And in this sutta, it elaborates by saying, the person has such a view. There is meaning in giving, sacrifice, and offerings. There are fruits and results of good and bad deeds. There is an afterlife. There are duties to mother and father. There are beings reborn spontaneously. And there are ascetics and Brahmins who are well attained and practiced, and who describe the afterlife after realizing it with their own insight. That's how a good person has the view of a good person. So it elaborates particularly around understanding certain aspects, particularly around karma, which is part of right view on the Buddhist Noble Eightfold Path, and also the kinds of qualities that one needs to have in terms of view. So it's about giving, sacrifice in terms of renunciation, and offerings towards those that are worthy of offerings. And when it comes to karma, understanding that there is cause and effect, that there are fruits or results, there are ramifications for our good and bad deeds, and understanding our duties towards parents, that we have a debt to parents in terms of that they enabled us to have this human birth. And it's a blessing because it's very rare to come into the human world. And of course, all the things associated with afterlife, lower realms, higher realms, understanding the whole spectrum when it comes to our predicament. So it's very important in that respect, when you associate with good people, that these people remind you. Good people remind you how precious this human birth is, and to attend to penetrating the Buddha's teaching, so that we are not roaming in ignorance constantly in samsara. That's what the noble people will actually remind you. Good people know this truth, that birth leads to the whole mass of suffering again due to aging and death. And then, of course, it's talked about the gifts of a good person. And generosity is a huge component part of the path. That generosity is actually the side of the coin that is the same as renunciation. So you start off with generosity at its most basic level, giving, sharing, helping. But when you start to cultivate generosity on the Buddha's path, it becomes more than that, because when you renunciate, you relinquish that which is what you would have had for yourself, and you share it with others. But when you keep attending to that, when you keep developing generosity in that respect, the renunciation, what that becomes is the renunciation of tanha, the craving, the origin of suffering. And so that's the intermediate, which leads to the advanced practice. And there are different meditations for that. But when you're around a good person, one that is manifesting and walking the Noble Eightfold Path, then you learn that generosity has these different grades to it, different layers to it, and one can advance from that path. So these are the important things that come with associating with good people, that it's not simply about associating with nice people, that it's not simply that the qualities are those of worldly qualities of good people. They're actually much more than that. And so when you associate with good people in this way, then many things rub off, if not help to put some fire, a sense of urgency behind one's practice, but also to get the Dhamma right. And so when you reflect on the fact that the Buddha is the ultimate good kind of person, the sappurisa, then when you're around the Buddha's words, it's extremely helpful and very inspiring, and also leading to other qualities such as wisdom, mindfulness, being learned, and then cultivating such things as conviction. But it very much, all these things start with associating with good people, the people that point us in the right direction. The Buddha makes a very direct point when it comes to the distinction between associating with good people and associating with bad people. In the Avijjā Sutta, which is in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 14, discourse number 29, the Buddha essentially says that when you associate with bad people, what it leads to is the wrong path, and in this case, the wrong tenfold path. Whereas when you associate with good people, that leads to the noble tenfold path. And what the Buddha mentions is that beings come together and converge because of an element, and the element is actually beginning with the wrong view in the case of associating with bad people, And in the case of good people, it's right view, which leads to the Noble Eightfold or Tenfold Path. So what's really important is to really know that, to really take that to heart, that the more you associate with the element of akusala, so the unwholesome, those that breed defilements, those that have bad qualities, those that don't abandon the hindrances, then you're actually supporting and encouraging towards the wrong path. And in contrast, when you associate with good people, it's entirely the opposite. These people always support and encourage abandoning of hindrances, removing defilements, cultivating wholesome deeds by body, speech and mind, cultivating the qualities that the Buddha recommends towards the trainee path: conviction, moral shame, fear of wrongdoing, being learned in the Buddha's teachings, being mindful, wise, and having energy towards that, towards kusala, towards wholesome. Another way that the Buddha emphasizes this to the monks is the Cankama Sutta, Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 14, discourse 15. And this discourse is actually quite straightforward. The Buddha is talking to the monks, and he points out the various arahants. He points to Venerable Sariputta, and he talks about all the people following Venerable Sariputta or walking with him being those of great wisdom. He points to Venerable Mahamoggallana and says the several mendicants with him are the ones that have great psychic power. The same for Venerable Kassapa, Mahakassapa. He talks about those being the ones that advocate austerities. And he goes through a whole list of noble arahants. But then he comes to Devadatta. And with Devadatta, he points to him and says, those are the mendicants that have bad wishes or bad desires. And again, he says, beings come together and converge because of an element. And so those who have bad attitude, bad intentions, they come together and converge with those with the bad attitude and bad intentions, and therefore bad practice. But those with the good attitude, the good intentions, they come together and they converge because they have the good attitude and the good practice. So the Cankama Sutta is actually very powerful when you reflect on it, and you reflect particularly on Devadatta, that when it came to him, that he gathered all the people that still wanted to walk the wrong path, who didn't want to remove defilements, didn't want to abandon hindrances, didn't want to cultivate the qualities that the Buddha recommended, but the ones that he thought were more important. So when we actually look at this beginning part of the path, we actually need to actually be very, very clear the distinction that the Buddha makes from these good and bad elements, and to look at who we converge with and the type of example that we are in terms of our own practice. That these things that the Buddha gives us, they're not just guidelines for assessing and diagnosing others that we associate with, but it's also the guidelines and the notes that look at ourselves, that are we the right kinds of good people that the Buddha would recommend for others to associate with. And of course we're going to fall short because we're trainees on the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. But what's really important is how quickly we diagnose our own shortcomings and correct them. So we don't allow them to linger, we don't abide with defilements, we don't rest with the hindrances, and we don't linger around guilt and remorse when it comes to wrongdoings. We actually fix it and have the almost like relinquishment of them there and then. Most of you will know the story of Angulimala, and for those that don't, he was the murderer who eventually ordained under the Buddha and realized full awakening, so realized Nibbana. And Angulimala's story was actually that the Buddha saved him just before he was about to commit his 1000th kill. And that 1000th kill would have been his mother. So as we know from the Buddha, killing your mother or your father has very, very, very severe consequences. And so those consequences for Angulimala would have been quite tragic and awful. And he would have been in the hell realms for eons. So instead, the Buddha was able to draw him towards the path, and he ordained, and he still had to bear with certain karma that, as a result of being a murderer, that still ripened even as a monk, and it was actually quite difficult. But when Angulimala realized Nibbana, the monks were actually quite curious and quite surprised. And so they went to the Buddha and they asked how it was that such a ferocious murderer could actually realize full awakening in the same life. And so the Buddha actually counseled them and let them know that it was because Angulimala had come across the Buddha and had learnt the Dhamma from the Buddha and associated with Buddha and the noble arahants and those that were training towards Nibbana. So Buddha uttered this saying, "One whose evil conduct is replaced by good illumes the world like the moon released from the clouds." So the emphasis is on, good conduct. But in the story around Angulimala, it's quite clear that he was very, very fortunate, firstly to have a human birth, but secondly, after doing such awful things and breaking such, having such poor sila, breaking one of the worst, which is killing living beings, that he could still be saved. That by associating with good people, and that ultimate good person is the Buddha, then the noble arahants, and then all the ones training towards the path, that he was saved. And so it's quite a remarkable story when you think about associating with good people from that perspective, that there's something very powerful about the Buddha's words. And as we know from the insight pathway of the way out of ignorance, what it says is that associating with good people fills up, then that leads to being the causal condition for hearing the true Dhamma. So this is particularly true in the case of Angulimala, and in the case of us too, that when we associate with good people, then we have the opportunity to hear the good Dhamma. In our case, it can be people that are sharing Buddha Dhamma, or it can be the Buddha's words directly, such as what we're listening to here. We're listening to the Buddha's actual words. And so that is the link between associating with good people and hearing true Dhamma. In the Vasakkara Sutta, the Buddha talks about being able to know a good or a bad person, and he's having a discussion with the Brahmin. This is in Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 4, discourse number 187. And this Brahmin is asking some very pointed questions of the Buddha about whether a bad person can know a bad person or a good person, and likewise whether a good person can know a bad person or a good person. What's really interesting about the Buddha's answer is that in the case of a bad person, the Buddha says it's impossible for a bad person to know a good person, and also impossible for a bad person to know a good person. And that is somewhat shocking, because most of us think, we know how to tell the distinction. But in the case of a bad person, the Buddha is very clear that that person can't. And it's primarily due to the bad qualities that person is breeding, that they breed defilements which trouble the mind. They don't abandon the hindrances, so that's where that person is abiding. And then when it comes to the qualities that the Buddha recommends, that person is not cultivating and developing those wholesome qualities. And so through body, speech and mind, that person is cultivating the unwholesome. And so definitely not walking the Buddha's Noble Eightfold or Tenfold Path. So that's why a bad person cannot, and in the case of the Buddha says it's impossible for a bad person to know the difference between a good person and a bad person. And if you remember, the Buddha said that a bad person quickly praises those that are worthy of criticism, and they praise those that are, and they criticize those that are worthy of praise. So that is the problem when it comes to a bad person. They don't know. And so when you associate with such a person, they're always glorifying people that are not worthy of being glorified, including themselves. And they're belittling people that are noble, that are worthy of praise. So it's quite dire from that perspective. Now, when it comes to a good person, the Buddha says that a good person, it is possible for a good person to know of a good person, and it is possible for a good person to know of a bad person. So they are more well equipped. So a Buddha is ultimately the person that definitely knows how to assess good and bad people. Same with the Noble Arahants. And then with trainees on the path, then for us, it is possible. So when it comes to that, we assess from being able to see that by quick assessment, we can see, okay, this person is not worthy of praise. They're the ones that are that should be criticized. And likewise, we praise only the noble ones. And this comes from a place of knowing the distinction between wholesome and unwholesome. And the sutta that's really complementary to this is the sutta where the Buddha talks about a bad person glorifying themselves and belittling others, using the yardstick of attainments and worldly things such as their family background, their wealth, material possessions, their power, their popularity and fame. So when you assess on that basis, then you know you're actually not in a very good position. Whereas from a good perspective, you actually assess not on those things at all. You don't glorify and belittle as a result of those things. And you can see that on the Dhamma path, that when you get imbued with labha sakara silokam, when one gets imbued with gain, honor, and popularity, one starts to decline on the spiritual path. And so it's very important to associate with people that are not imbued with fame, honor or respect, and this popularity, that you're actually more humble, less conceited. Because in that way, you can actually be guided on the path in the right way. So a practical way of looking at this important component part to the Noble Eightfold Path of associating with good people rather than bad people is a number of contemplations. And it's really some questions we ask ourselves. We can do this eyes open or we could do it eyes closed. But it's really an investigation and examination for ourselves where we stand when it comes to who we associate with. So the first kind of prompt is really, who do we associate or spend the most time with? This is almost like data gathering for ourselves, because sometimes we don't consciously look at this. We just kind of do it habitually. So of course there's going to be people that we spend time with at home, our families. There's going to be people that we spend time with at work. And this is quite a huge part of the time that we have in the day. Then there's people we spend time with who are friends. There's people that we spend time with in our Dhamma communities. And of course there are people outside of that with different interests and activities that we are joined with. But one of the aspects that we forget is the time we spend with people through the TV, through the internet, through social media, through sports, through reading material, fiction, non-fiction. And when we forget that, what we don't realize is that we haven't assessed whether our reading material, whether it's online or in tangible form, is also something that is good or bad company. And it's a very important point to make when you actually investigate it, because what you're actually digesting through that material is other people's views and opinions, other people's minds. So when you look at this first prompt of who do we associate or spend the most time with, it's very important to actually include those things on there. So it includes time we spend on the internet, movies that we watch, what we Netflix, what we watch in terms of the news, what we watch in terms of any kind of digestible input. And include that, because it leads to the next question. Are they good people as defined by the Buddha? So what we've been through today, do they keep the 5 precepts? Do they understand the Noble Eightfold Path? Do they breed unwholesome qualities or wholesome qualities? All those sorts of things. Because when you make that assessment and then you realize the quantity of time one spends with those kinds of people, and they're influencing one's mind, influencing one's habits, influencing the direction that one goes towards, then you actually start to recognize, is this good or bad towards the spiritual path? So this contemplation is specifically towards the spiritual path. It's not about everyday life, because you would get a different answer. But when it comes to something where you want to progress on the path, where you want to develop the path towards awakening, then these are very important questions to answer. And so the third prompt is, do they encourage and support wholesome qualities? And this is the thing, when we talk about wholesome qualities, we talk about qualities that make the mind happy, that concentrate the mind. They're not qualities that breed the defilements, that allow you to remain in the hindrances, so allow you to remain with restlessness and worry, dullness and drowsiness, sensual desire, ill will, doubt. No, wholesome qualities are the ones that are free of defilements, free of hindrances. So this is very important, that sappurisa, as we know, they encourage you to abandon, not just observe, but abandon unwholesome qualities, and then to cultivate, develop things like metta bhavana, things that are going to calm the mind down, that are for the well-being of everyone. And so the fourth prompt is, do they encourage you towards the Buddha's words and his method of instruction? I think this is very clear. Like when you think about Angulimala, he heard the Buddha's words. He heard the words of the Noble Arahants by ordaining and being around all the people that were training, if not completed the path. And so in the same way for us, if we want to make progress, if we want to develop, if we want to understand the Buddha's words better and have wisdom, then we need to be around those that encourage us towards the Buddha's words and his method of instruction. And the interesting thing about this when it comes to Dhamma, there are many Dhamma communities that encourage other teachings, and that includes Buddhist communities. They don't encourage us towards reading the Buddha's words, hearing the Buddha's exact words, knowing what the Buddha actually means from his various teachings, and same with the Noble Arahants. And those that are not very systematic in explaining the method of instruction. So what happens is you get a very mixed up kind of teaching. It's not clear. So it's very important to know the distinction, because sappurisas, at the very heart of sappurisas, they're very willing to listen to the Buddha's instruction. They're very suvajja. This is a very important quality. For us to understand and penetrate the Buddha's teaching, and to do that more quickly, one has to be suvajja. That means willing to be instructed, willing to be admonished, and in some ways obedient to the way the Buddha taught. So when you're around people that are very suvajja towards the Buddha and the Noble Arahants, then this is something that is very strong. The Buddha's words are very strong. They're the ultimate medicine. And his method of instruction becomes somewhat clearer that there is something to the insight pathways. There is something in the way that the Buddha uses words. They're not just any words, they're actually very penetrative. And so this is something that one needs to actually make sure, as part of assessing who you're associating with, you ask this question: do they encourage you towards the Buddha's actual words and his method of instruction? And then the next prompt is, are their views, ideas, and interests in line with the Buddha's teachings? So as we saw from the Chulapunama Sutta, we need to be sure that we're influenced in the right way, because when we associate with bad people, we consciously or unconsciously adopt their views, ideas, and interests. And if they're not in line with the Buddha's, then the danger is always going towards the wrong path, And we don't want to be like Devadatta, with the bad qualities, the bad view, the bad virtue, all of those things. Instead, we want to make sure. So this examination, this prompt, is to really see, if I watch this program, what kind of views, what kind of ideas, what kind of interests are being consciously or unconsciously endorsed by me? If I associate with a particular community, a particular, person, again, the same thing. And so it's really about conscious choices. Once you make the assessment, you're in a better position to make conscious choices about the weight of a particular person or a particular movie or a particular news item or reading material or community. You're able to weigh up, how much endorsement do I give to this community, this reading material, this person? And you start to make wiser choices around it. All this contemplation is to help us. And then the next prompt is, do they help us to make spiritual progress? In some cases, it's easy to see certain things actually hinder our spiritual progress. Quite obvious, because they tear the mind apart, they imbue it with more defilements, they make you tolerate that which is not worthy to be tolerated. And various things like that, that it's really quite important to actually make that conscious choice, to actually assess and then make that conscious choice, because we don't actually want to hinder the path, we want to make spiritual progress. And so associating with bad people actually is something that is a huge hindrance. If you remember, the Buddha encourages suvicca or suvicca satta, so being willing to be instructed, with kalyanamitta, good people. That's what leads to distinction. That's from the Dasuttara Sutta in the Digha Nikaya, the last sutta in the Digha Nikaya. That when one is willing to be instructed and has good company, good friendships in Dhamma, then spiritual progress happens. The opposite leads to the decline. So if you're dovicca satta, that you're unwilling to be instructed, unwilling to be admonished, and you have bad friendships, papa mitata, then that leads to the decline in one's progress. So this is the link that we're trying to overcome when we look at this contemplation. Does our company help us make spiritual progress? And the next prompt is, how is the mind after spending time with different people? And so you compare and contrast. You compare and contrast the different communities you spend time with, the different people you spend time with, online or in person. And you really seriously look at it. Each person is different, and each person on the spiritual path is different in terms of the amount of time that they give to spiritual practice and the amount of intention they have towards advancement. So when you assess this, it's really from that intention. And so those that are really persevering and wanting to go quite quickly, then you really examine it quite harshly. And for those that are, having to balance priorities on the spiritual path and having to manage certain responsibilities, then you kind of manage it in a way that is a bit more light touch, but at least you're looking at it. So then you look at how the mind is. And when you look at how the mind is, you're really saying, does the mind get really happy? Is the mind joyful? Can the mind easily concentrate after spending time with such people? And if the mind easily concentrates, there's not too much cleaning up that needs to be done in the mind, then you know that company is fairly good. And if you simply spend time with the Buddha by listening to the suttas, by reading the suttas, and so on and so forth, you'll see the distinction. Whereas when you spend time with unwholesome company, bad people, then the mind ends up being quite defiled, quite stained. And so it's similar to the Vatupa Sutta, you need to clean it up. You need to clean it before it's able to concentrate, before the mind can get happy. Instead, you notice when the mind's quite troubled, quite down, quite heavy, not luminous. And so that tells you, it gives you the answer. And so then the last prompt is, do we consciously prioritize who we spend time with? And this is a very leading question, and for a reason, because where we come to is when we make all these assessments in our contemplation, we should come to the point where we are able to tweak, manage, make different choices. And this is not about pushing people away as such, but it's actually about how we make contact with good and bad company and prioritizing that time spent, because we only have limited waking hours. And so if the majority of the time is spent with bad people, then we need to re-engineer that. And if it can't be helped because we're at work for most of our day, then at least we need to put some security guards in place. So when you think about Indriya Samvara, which we come to later in looking at the insight pathway for the way out of ignorance, and we already know this from the Pamada Vihari Sutta, from the Indriya Samvara Sutta, from even the Karaniyametta Sutta, Indriya Samvara or Santindriyo is around security guards. That we might want to limit certain conversations around people that are not walking the Noble Eightfold Path. Doesn't mean we don't have conversations. It might be because of work, family, what have you. But we limit the conversations so we don't breed the wrong kinds of speech, the wrong kinds of actions, and the wrong kinds of thought. And that's a wise thing to do. But you come to that after doing this contemplation, because you need to see for yourself what that is. And then you can easily make that decision. Whereas when you haven't gone through this contemplation and you don't have the conviction about seeing why it's challenging, then you can't make a conscious choice so easily. And really what it's about is making changes to support the path and seeing where to make those changes to support the path. The other side of this, which we haven't been through, is how we actually look at this in ourselves. And then that may be something that we'll do in a separate session, a shorter session, because I think for this one, it's very good to look at association in terms of, good people versus bad people, and really looking at it. So I'm going to leave it here. This is something for contemplation, some Dhamma from the Buddha, and then for us to contemplate and then to put it into practice. And this is the first part of looking at the way out of ignorance. And at some point we're going to join it all together. But I think these little segments help us to digest some of the deep Dhamma that Buddha is pointing us to. So we can share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you all well. Theruvan Saranai.